Hello, this video is going to be about how I trained the one-arm three-finger drag, which is video 2 out of a 3-part series on finger strength training. It was very cool to see the amazing responses to the first video. I saw the Reddit post and appreciate everyone who put in a comment. One comment that particularly caught me by surprise was from Stephen Lowe, who is author of the Overcoming Gravity book. Some forums consider it to be a gold standard in learning calisthenics skills, and I just thought it was pretty cool because I've owned this book for about 3 years and reference it a lot whenever I try a new skill. The main critique I received for that last video is that I didn't back up certain claims with research. I do recognize that it's important to cite sources, but there's numerous reasons why I don't go out of my way to do it. My videos are naturally very long, and citing research papers will add another level of complexity to making them, and I don't think citing research really makes my message that much more impactful. With that said, almost everything in this video is anecdotal. Also keep in mind that there are multiple ways to achieve a common goal. I honestly don't even know if this method is a good method to get the one-arm three-finger drag for most people. I just know that it worked well for me. I hope that there will be something that you can take away from my journey. And similar to the last video, I'll include a summary slide at the end that encompasses all of the high yield points. But without further ado, there's a lot to unpack in this video, so let's get started. The three-finger drag is a good grip to have in one's tool bag because the majority of climbers tend to over-rely on the half-crimp grip. Compared to various forms of crimping, using the open hand grip loads the finger pulleys significantly less, and in his book Make or Break, Dave McLeod favors an even balance of open hand and crimped climbing as it can significantly decrease the risk of pulley injuries. He additionally states that compared to crimping, the open hand grip can be stronger on certain holds and can also give you another centimeter of reach on spanned moves. But utilizing this grip does not come without risks. Since the topic of three-finger dragging to avoid injury is often talked about, I once had a false narrative that this grip was very safe, so safe that you'd have very little chance of getting injured from it, and this is one of the biggest misconceptions I've had in climbing. In early attempts to train the one-arm three-finger drag, I tried to hang maximally off of the larger edges of the Beastmaker during hangboard sessions, but what this resulted in were flexor tendon strains near both of my wrists within a couple weeks of each other. Compared to mild pulley injuries, I would say that these injuries were more consequential. The left-sided injury healed almost completely and very fast, whereas my right-sided injury was more long-lasting, and till this day, I still suffer a little bit of weakness in this hand that I attribute to that injury, and it's been around 2 years now. As seen in Dr. Tyler Nelson's post, open hand grips predispose you to their own subset of injuries, namely tendon, joint capsule, and ligamentous injuries, compared to crimp grips, which are infamously pulley injuries, joint cartilage, and tendon sheath. The flexor tendon injury happened around this area, and since the tendon, the wrist, and the fingers are a bit interconnected and function as one unit, the wrist instability caused by the injury caused a lot of cracking in my wrist, and then I also had some on and off PIP joint inflammation here, which was pretty debilitating for performance climbing. I tried a lot of rehab exercises that didn't really help until a couple months ago, where I realized 3 things really helped. Number 1 would be avoiding exercises that are too taxing on the wrist joints, particularly ones that cause ranges of motion where the joints would crack, which would cause instability to persist. For example, when I wanted to do a hypertrophy phase for my forearms, I used to use the $7 pipe contraption versus the Arm Shark, which is around $70. The pipe often allowed me to be more time efficient by working both forearms at once, but it made my wrist pop and crack a lot compared to the Arm Shark, where you can be more controlled. After stopping this wrist curl exercise with the pipe, my wrist did feel a lot better and my flares pretty much went away. There's pros and cons to it because sometimes you do want a hypertrophy phase to gain more strength, but you don't want to be overly inflamed to the point where it affects your climbing ability. Number 2 is stretching the forearms on rest days because after training sessions, your muscles will likely be pretty tense, and this tightness can translate to the tendons and joints that attach to it. So by making the muscles more relaxed, you're relieving tension on the tendons and joints. Overall, too, a lot of flares and persistent tendonitis in climbers is due to them being overly neurotic about touching it, fiddling with it, cracking it to relieve the discomfort all the time. But from personal experience, I think that flares tend to better go away the more you leave them alone when you're not climbing. But the question remains, why did I injure not one but two flexor tendons? After training the three finger drag for quite a while, I've realized that if you are warm for the half crimp max hangs, this does not equate to being warm for the three finger drag max hangs. Different grip positions utilize muscles and fibers within the forearm and hand differently, so it's beneficial to have focused warm-ups for each. For example, I find that even after climbing on the moonboard for about an hour and being super recruited in my half crimp grip, my three finger drag would feel like it's barely recruited at all. I would have to dedicate at least a couple sets of three finger dragging and increasing intensity to warm it up. And the less three finger drag you do in your usual climbing, the more you have to set aside time to do this. This is one of the first main points of the video, which is preparing for the three finger drag to pull heavy loads requires a warm up separate from the half crimp grip. This is because the grips significantly differ in their joint angle. I learned this from the Rock Climbers Training Manual from the Anderson brothers. In order for finger strength training to be effective, climbers need to train at the precise joint angles they want to strengthen. I'm going to add a loose association to the statement, which is when finger strength training, you need to warm up the precise joint angle as well. The book also states, strength gains occur within 15 degrees of the joint angle that is trained, so climbers should carefully consider which grip positions to train, which is probably why strength transfer is better between the half crimp and the full crimp grip, but the transfer is so poor between the half crimp and the three finger drag. If you want to be strong at both, you have to train both. After getting the one arm half crimp, I made the transition to learning the one arm three finger drag. As mentioned from a previous video, I sustained a pulley injury in the left index finger on the moonboard, which was also a reason to train the three finger drag now because the grip did not agitate the pulley injury at all. McLeod even states, in fact, even if you have a moderately bad pulley tear, you might be able to climb without pain using a full open-handed grip. During this dedicated three finger drag strengthening period, I still played around with the one arm half crimps, usually doing 3 sets of 20mm one arm hangs when adequately warm to maintain that strength. And during the rest of each half crimp set, I would start a slow warm up ramp of the three finger drag, pulling progressively heavier loads. Then for the actual working sets, I did 4 sets of 4 three finger drag pulls on the 10mm edge because this was the edge that involved mostly the distal phalanx. In theory, I did so because of forearm flexor anatomy, namely the flexor digitorum superficialis and the flexor digitorum profundus. Tendons of the FDS insert into the middle phalanx of the fingers, while tendons of the FDP actually run through the superficialis and attach to the distal phalanx. My 10mm edge approach focused on almost trying to target the FDP because intuitively the three finger drag grip used on smaller edges tend to engage the FDP more than the FDS, although both muscles are involved in some degree. And because I think I already trained the FDS pretty profoundly learning the one arm half crimp, the low hanging fruit was to increase the FDP strength. The 10mm edge was also more comfortable because the 20mm edge can really press on your middle phalanx and cause discomfort, especially on heavier loads. The overall concept was the same as the previous video though, getting the pulls to be close to my actual body weight as much as possible for the one arm hang. Because this was pulling off of a 10mm edge and my goal was to hang off a 20mm edge, I approximated that the 10mm max pull to be 20 to 30 pounds lower than my actual body weight to be able to hang on the 20mm edge. Because cumulatively this is a lot of pulls on a very small edge, it was easy for the skin to thin out, especially around the middle finger DIP joint area, which is why in the video you see me tape that area on both hands. This also goes back to the idea that lifting a standard 4 sets of 4 is like 16 microtraumas to the hand. In retrospect, an alternative of what I've learned to do is do sets of just lifting the weight and holding it for around 7 seconds, which pretty much simulates a hangboarding routine, and it does not wear down your skin like consecutive lifts. If you do try this 7-second approach, expect the weight that you can pull and hold to be lower than what you normally do for a 4-rep approach because it is more time under tension. I think the gains you get out of these two approaches are pretty similar, and it just comes down to documenting your progress and lifting heavier loads over time, but I just like the added benefit that it does not tear away your skin and you can leave that skin for actual climbing. Nonetheless, this arm lift method still gave some good gains where I would aim for an intensity where 4 reps was possible and 5 reps was too hard. Looking back at my log, a progression rule of thumb is if I was able to do 4 reps for a majority of the sets, I would try to go up in weight the next session. If I was able to hit 5 reps for some sets, I would definitely go up in the weight, usually around added 5 pounds in the beginning, and then an added 2.5 pounds when the progress slows down significantly. As mentioned in previous videos, the best lift sessions are usually after a climbing session with everything already warm. You can see the stark difference on days I'm in a pinch and have to do a warm-up and session at home. It just doesn't hit the same. It can also get addicting to add more and more weight, but if you can only lift around 2 to 3 reps, it's better to back off to a point where you can lift 4, which is kind of a magic number. Going too intense to the point where you can only do 2 to 3 generally does not produce any good gains for the next session from personal experience. And some days you kind of have to gauge lowering the weight as well, depending on how much you've climbed beforehand. I think I was just particularly psyched to board climb this day, trying a lot of hard climbs, so I went lower on the weight, usually around 5 to 10 pounds lower on each hand from the last session. I think a majority of people like to warm up on the board, do their max pulls to get recruited, and then return to the board to climb more, which solves this issue completely. But I kind of like to just have my max pulls at the end of the session. It's just a matter of personal preference. I was making steady gains with this routine, with some days not even having to do a 4th set. But as soon as you reach 100 pounds of load and more, skin issues become more prominent. When you're training on such a small 10mm edge with high load, doing 12 to 16 reps per hand, that's a lot of repetitive pressure down on a very small area. My skin started to not recover adequately in between sessions as the first pad of my middle finger began to wear down more, causing me to slip and dry fire a lot. At this point, the limiting factor for me to get stronger was less so weight and more so skin and the amount of friction I had on my fingers. With less friction, I had to compensate with more effort just so the block doesn't slip, and this prevents squeezing out that last 4th rep on the later sets, which can be very valuable over the long term. And once the skin gets even more thin, the pain just serves as a dead stopper that prevents you from pulling altogether.
NANI?!
I made the transition to similar training that would be less taxing on the skin, which was 2 arm hangs on the 10mm edges of the hangboard. I like the transgression board or plastic hangboards in general because the edges were more positive and bite more compared to wooden hangboards. And this is crucial because you want a very secure contact point when you're hanging open hand on a small edge at your max. I also got really into using Rhino Perform because it keeps your fingertips really dry. Like you can climb a boulder, get off, and there will still be chalk left on your tips, which is pretty amazing. This stuff is amazing. For these hangs, I emphasized actively engaging and flexing the most distal joint of the index and ring finger because on the 10mm, only my first pad would make contact with the board. Early on in the process, it definitely was hard to engage the middle finger. Like I felt like my middle finger was just there to make contact with the board, but it was definitely hard to flex the most distal joint. And for the first sesh, I also noted that there was some discomfort in the tendon of my ring finger, but that went away the next session, most likely because it was like a new exercise and it's kind of like a little shock to my body, but there was no injury whatsoever. In terms of skin, doing these 3 sets of 7-second hangs were a lot better than doing those multiple reps of off the ground pulls, and that really benefited my climbing sessions. But after a few sessions, I plateaued on loading more with this exercise, and I was still not able to convert it to a 1-arm hang. I do have people calling me impatient, but if I plateau for multiple sessions, I do find it very helpful to switch things up to see if I can improve my numbers in any way. I met a strong climber in the hangboard room at that time who was doing 7-3 repeaters with band-assisted 1-arm hangs, which I tried out and found it to be very challenging. Challenging enough that I would only do 1 set of 6 repeaters, and later on I would only extend myself to doing 2 sets. At that point, I kind of just wanted something that was not too comfortable, something that would shock my body and spur some meaningful adaptations. The main thing I got out of this exercise was that I felt an immediate boost to my power endurance, which really helped send some longer moonboard problems that previously stumped me. But in theory and in reality, this exercise used an assisted band, which did not push me towards the upper limits of my strength to a point where I would be able to do the 1-arm hang. And doing these multiple repetitions was similar to off-the-ground lifts, which I found not to be great for skin, and it was pretty uncomfortable because the 20mm edge really presses up on your middle phalanx, and it would kind of hurt. So I would not recommend this exercise if you want the 1-arm 3-finger drag. I'm only demonstrating this so you can learn from my trial and error. Overall, doing this was a little too intense for me and caused some flare on my chronically inflamed ring finger, the one related to my tendon strain when I first started training for the 1-arm 3-finger drag. I decided to take a deload week where I'd still train a little bit, but mostly lay off on any intense climbing. During that time, I did a 7-day fast where I lost 6 pounds. I did vlog the entire experience, At first, my motivations for losing the weight was obviously to benefit climbing performance, but later I realized it was a huge spiritual and introspective experience as well. Towards the end, it was one of those things that I did just to prove myself that I can do it. At the time, I was reading David Goggins' book, which does emphasize a lot about digging deep and exploring your own human potential. And even though this fast was far from dangerous, I realized that it was just something most people these days will never experience, which made the experience that much more special. I was also genuinely curious about the metabolism of being in a fasted state, and coming off of my first medical school board exam, which heavily emphasizes biochemistry and metabolism pathways, I was increasingly motivated. It's like counting down for the new year. Goal reached. You hit your fasting goal. It was funny because before the fast, the only person who knew I was going to do it was Zeno. I don't think he really took me seriously because it was so outlandish of an idea, but he did cook the very last dinner I ate. The last big meal. Let's see how long I last. But thank you, Zeno.
There's more chicken breast, more asparagus, more broccoli. You might want to eat like all of this.
I went to his house the next week to climb for the very first session after the fast, and I remember prefacing to him, "Hey Zeno, do you remember what I told you I'd do this week?" He literally guessed everything but the 7-day fast, and when I reminded him that I actually did it, he was absolutely mind fucked. But this was the first session coming back after the fast. I was lean as hell. We had a pretty fun session, and lo and behold, I got the one arm, three finger drag for the first time. And lo and behold, I got the one arm, three finger drag for the first time, which I think was due to two factors. Number one was obviously dropping the weight. Even though 6 pounds is not a whole lot, a difference in even 1 to 2 pounds when you're at your limit is huge. Number two was that I mistaken the 25 millimeter edge at Zeno's place to be a 20 millimeter edge. I pulled on it and was like, something about your cable setup or how worn down your hangboard is feels very comfortable. I literally thought it was 20 millimeters until 5 minutes ago making this video when I researched the board and found out it was 25. But nonetheless, since I thought this edge was 20 that just happened to be more comfortable, the next week I went back to the Beastmaker, acknowledged that it's just going to be a little less comfortable than the previous hangboard, and just whipped it out. Which makes me think that if your strength is high enough and your weight is low enough, the perceived actual force that you apply to hang off of these two different edges are very, very similar. And I think the difference of being able to hang off the 20 millimeter edge is just a matter of being able to deal with the added discomfort of the edge digging into your middle phalanx bone. So for viewers, a good way to think of this is once you're able to hang off the 25 millimeter edge, you're very, very close. The last thing that's hindering a 20 millimeter hang is just getting over the perceived discomfort. Once you can get over that, it's a done deal. At least from my experience, a big part of actually doing the 20 mil hang is just breaking past that mental barrier. I pretty much imagined that the 25 millimeter was a 20 millimeter and hung. And once I had that sensation of hanging, it was such a huge mental boost that it quickly led me to succeed on the real thing. After finding out I was capable of hanging, the session after was my first time attempting to hang on the Beastmaker edge. The edge was more uncomfortable and smaller than the one at Zeno's, but the mental aspect of believing that I can hang did matter a lot, and this belief got me to at least lift my legs off the ground. The next session, strength was more or less the same, right worse than left because of my previously stated injury. I did find it pretty difficult to execute a longer hang time on the right hand, but there was something I discovered the next session that dramatically improved this. I think the biggest thing I can leave you off with, besides number one, dropping weight, number two, trialing the one arm hang on the 25 millimeter edge as a confidence boost for the less comfortable 20 millimeter edge, is number three, warming up with middle finger mono hangs. I think from any past hangboard attempt of the three finger drag, whether it was two-handed or one-handed, I often find it easy for me to actively flex the distal joint of my index and ring fingers, but it was often difficult to actively engage the middle finger because of how much weight is on it and because of the angle in which it contacts the edge, which is slightly different from the index and ring fingers. Intuitively, I thought that if I can work up my fingers to do monos with two hands on an edge that only involved the distal phalange, which on the Beastmaker is this for most people, I would be able to recruit the middle finger enough to contribute well towards the three finger drag. I thought it was going to take me at least a while to do this, not having trained monos ever, but I actually was able to do it in one session. Pleasantly surprised. The trick is gradually warming up to it. On the one day that I trained for the mono hangs, I was able to achieve it through 3 sets. For set 1, feet were still on the ground. actively flexing the distal phalanx of my middle fingers, pulling around 50% of my body weight. For set 2, my feet were still on the ground and I was pulling around 80 to 90% of body weight, still pretty low intensity, but I was also trying to get my legs close to hovering. You can repeat this as necessary depending on how warm you feel, but by set 3, I was able to lift my legs off the ground and hang between 5 to 7 seconds. I usually cap it at around 3 sets for the warm up, but if you're curious, usually a fourth set would usually get me to around 12 to 14 seconds. Results will differ depending on your weight and how trained you are. I was particularly light during this period, but this was what I was able to do on the first day. The key really is to not be in a rush, making sure that you are as warm as possible so you don't get injured. At this point, I took out the warm up using weighted hangs and replaced them by warming up with monos. How fast you warm up pretty much varies by the day, so for this day, by the second set, I felt warm enough to just start hanging for about 3 seconds. By warming up the monos to hang around 7 seconds before transitioning to working the one-arm three-finger drag, I was able to increase the recruitment of my middle fingers, which increased the strength output and hang times pretty noticeably. With the mono warm-ups, you can see that my right hand started to more closely match the hang times of my left, which was pretty unbalanced before. Here's me attempting some one-arm pull-ups off the three-finger drag, which were unsuccessful because for a couple months I stopped training the one-arm pull-up, which taught me a powerful lesson that if you don't use it, you lose it. Since my left hand was already pretty strong, for the subsequent sessions where I applied the mono recruitment technique, it was not uncommon for me to hang even up to 12 seconds on the left hand. This was my last day of training the one-arm three-finger drag, partly because I wasn't too psyched about training it anymore after figuring it out, and also because none of my projects really relied heavily on three-finger dragging. At this point, I had sufficient footage to put out this video, but I chose to delay it because number one, I really wanted to see how much weight did play a factor, so for the rest of 2024, I documented one-arm three-finger drag training during a period of lean bulking and cutting. Number two, since I stopped training the three-finger drag cold turkey, I'd have a period where I'd lose the one-arm three-finger drag completely and have to relearn it, which would bring new insights. Lastly, although partially relieved by mono warm-ups, my right hand still felt noticeably weaker than my left hand in terms of hang times, and I wanted to add any experiences towards addressing this. 5 months later, I decided to train the three-finger drag again because I began to climb at places that required more grip variety, particularly open hand strength. I also got more psyched climbing on the 2024 board, which was more open-handed, and there was a really advanced climber I met who utilized a great variety of grip types on the board, including the three-finger drag, which was pretty inspiring. I think it's particularly cool when you catch a reachy hold in three-finger drag and you reel that thing into a half crimp. Like that's steezy. To start the three-finger drag training back up, I did bodyweight hangs on the 10mm edge that targeted my last finger pad only. At this point in the video, I'll be adding the context of my body weight at the bottom right corner as well, due to relevance to the discussion. If there's a decimal, it means I took my body weight that day. If there's no decimal, the number is an estimate of what I weigh based around the days that I did take my weight. I didn't take my weight every day because I didn't want the thought of weight to affect the amount of effort I would expend. Each hang in this video was maximal effort. Here, I started to utilize the 15mm edge for weighted hangs too, just because sometimes I would climb so much during my outdoor project days that I would not have good enough skin to cling onto the 10mm edge, even with Perform and the use of a fan to dry the fingertips before hanging. There's pros and cons to each edge, and for the rest of the video, you'll see me utilizing the 15mm edge, the 10mm edge, the 10mm tension block edge, and the actual 20mm Beastmaker edge for one-arm hangs. I yo-yoed between different variations because each edge has its own utility and drawback. With smaller edges like the 10mm, you get good training stimulus with less weight, but it does require pretty good skin. The 15mm edge gives you more leeway when your skin sucks, but it requires heavier added weight to get the same stimulus, so it can be a little taxing on the shoulders. So on days such as a heavy pull-up day or a very shouldery climbing day, I'd pick the 10mm over the 15mm. It's good to have these options because from the strength training standpoint, the important thing is you track your numbers and try to progressively overload for each exercise. By logging different exercise variations, I was able to have a sense of conversions between exercises. Like if I can hang with added 35 pounds at 15mm, then I can usually hang around added 5 pounds with 10mm. I would just pick the appropriate edge to use on a particular training day depending on what was more lacking, the freshness in my shoulders or how much skin I still had on my fingertips. Later on, you'll also see me use off-the-ground pulls with the 10mm edge because it offers accurate tracking of progress by taking out the body weight factor, which is useful if you do any bulking or cutting in your training where there are swings in body weight. After capping out at around 35 pounds on the 15mm edge, I started to attempt the one arm hangs this date, which was pretty unsuccessful. This checks out because of my weight, 145 compared to when I achieved the one arm three finger drag, which was around 137. Despite a pretty thorough warm up with mono hangs plus some weighted activation hangs, I was not able to hang long at all. Something I did pick up during this period was to stack my mono warm-up hang regimen with weighted activation hangs together to be more time efficient with my warm-up. So I would usually do 3 sets. First is mono hangs with feet on the ground still with a back-to-back weighted activation hang. Then second set I would do mono hangs with my feet close to hovering with a back-to-back second weighted activation hang. Then for the third set I would do a mono hang with my feet off the ground plus an optional third weighted activation hang. And then after that, I would do one arm hangs, which is why I notated my sets like this. I would do the monos before the weighted hangs because monos can be more injurious and they require you to be more fresh and careful. I continued to do 35-pound hangs trying to push for heavier weight, but I seemed to plateau at this point. Some days numbers fluctuated based on how worn my skin was, but I took this picture here to note that even though my skin was pretty thin, I was still able to get some decent hang times on the 15mm edge just because it's much more forgiving than the 10mm edge. About half a month went by and I retested my one arm hang, which improved marginally, mainly due to having a strong day, strong warm up. At this weight, I mean, if you can get everything to align, perfect warm up, good skin, good sleep, healthy fingers, etc., it's definitely possible to hang, but I just knew that if I weighed a little less, it would be much easier to hang longer. I tried to convert to 10mm edge hangs because I had good skin on these days, hoping that the micro nature of the edges would provide some form of new stimulus. But yeah, with my weight being the same, the one arm hangs were on average the same.
High gravity day.
Yeah. Despite knowing that I had to lose weight for my one arm hang times to increase, I actually decided to experiment with a dedicated lean bulk for about 2 months and then a cut before climbing season, hoping to increase my forearm muscle size for better half crimp strength, which I will go over in the 15mm half crimp hang video. And this lean bulk was mainly inspired by a graph from the Anderson brothers book, highlighting the periodization of having a training weight for strength gain and later transitioning to a performance weight for the sens. My goal was to gain to around 150 pounds during the training phase and then cutting to around 135 pounds for the performance phase. As I gained weight during the lean bulk, it took a little while for me to catch on, but it was absolutely futile for me to continue attempting one arm hangs. Like at 148, bro, I could not lift myself off the ground anymore, and I told myself that this was the last time I'd attempt the one arm hang until I start cutting. So at this point, I just tried to maximize the weight that I can two arm hang for 7 seconds. I also made the transition to just training the three finger drag on the hangboard 1 day per week as maintenance until I could officially start doing one arm hangs again. This period was just prime forearm muscle building time with different exercises more dedicated for the half crimp. That is too much to include in this video, so I'll just save the discussion for the final 15mm one arm hang video. My forearms grew about a 1/4 inch on each side at the peak of the lean bulk, and I started cutting after that. The thing about just gaining around 6 or 7 pounds of weight though was I felt pretty heavy. Near the peak, I had to utilize the mono warm-up technique just so I can get the most recruited for my two arm hangs. And around 149 pounds, mono warm-ups felt so heavy that I just kept my feet on the ground for all 3 attempts because it felt too risky to fully hang. Another thing to point out here was eventually doing weighted two arm hangs made my shoulders feel tweaky. This new weight enlightened me of how unstable my shoulder complex was, which I attribute to a flaw in my training, which was no shoulder antagonist training. In previous videos, I was able to hang 70, 80 pounds with no problems to my shoulders, but here I found that even just adding 35 pounds made my shoulders twinge a little. I really didn't know what I was doing wrong, so I suffered a lot of small shoulder twinges and discomfort while hangboarding for about a month, until I figured out that if I worked on some shoulder antagonist exercises, particularly just adding 3 sets of 8 upward flies and doing that for about 1 to 2 times per week, it completely solved the issue, and I have yet to suffer any shoulder tweaks from hangboarding since. Doing these movements, which are components of the traditional lateral to front raise, are also pretty great, but yeah. I guess years and years of just training back with no antagonist exercises creeps up on you. On this date, I didn't make that realization that working on antagonists would fix my shoulder problem, so I switched to one arm lifts, which was actually a perfect transition because I was at the peak of the bulk and starting to cut, and doing lifts on the ground would benchmark my actual lifting strength without being too influenced by swings in my body weight, which were bound to happen. During the cut, as my weight dropped, I wanted to keep as much muscle as possible, so I kept my pull intensity and set volume just as high to preserve the gains. Even looking at the numbers now, it seemed to even improve a little bit despite being on a pretty aggressive cut. The strategies I employed to keep the gains during the cut is discussed in this video. At this point, I stopped doing the 10mm arm lifts because it was just not great for the skin. Even with my method where I just hold it for 7 seconds compared to what a lot of people do, which is doing 4 reps. I was weighing 140 pounds and discovered that the antagonist shoulder training would make my shoulders very robust for hangboarding heavier weights, so I went back to the 15mm edge weighted hangs. With some strength gains from the bulk, I was pulling in total a little bit more than before the bulk, which was rewarding and validating. As soon as my weight hit sub 140, I started to reintroduce one-arm hang attempts, which were much more manageable. Even after a long day outdoors, I was still able to have considerably more hang time at 135 than a day where I was pretty fresh at 145. At first, I trained the one arms 1 session per week, and later in the month, due to being more psyched about it, 2 times per week. However, training them 2 times per week didn't lead to the longer hang times. It was much more so because I was at a lower weight as my cut progressed, which makes me think that a 1 time per week 3-finger drag training regimen is sufficient for most climbers, even with this being an advanced skill. The aim of the second part of this video is to reinforce some main points. Number 1, showing the utility of using multiple modalities to train the 3-finger drag. Number 2, showing the importance of antagonist exercises. Number 3 is to discuss why weight is such a big deal with the 3-finger drag. There's a sweet spot where it becomes significantly more achievable, and the lower you weigh, even if it's just by 1 pound, the easier it will feel to a certain extent. Interestingly, being at a lower weight decreased the effort I needed to put into my warm-up as well. I remember when I weighed more, I'd have so many sets of monos and 2-arm weighted hangs just to feel warm enough to train the 3-finger drag. But it was kind of paradoxical because it was too much warm-up for such little performance because I was too heavy to even do 1-arm attempts. On the most recent session where I'm significantly lighter, the warm-up just took 2 mono warm-up sets, 1 with feet on the ground and 1 hanging, and some minor interspersed warming of the index and ring fingers without hanging off of them. 1 set where I tried to pull pretty hard with my feet on the ground still to recruit more strength for a hang, and by the next set I was able to start my working sets. Comparably, a lot less warm-up time with the lower weight. For closing remarks, although it might be quite obvious, probably the most important way to train the 20mm one-arm 3-finger drag is to train it itself. Being as specific to the move as possible once you're able to do it and not relying on other similar exercises. Because the one-arm hang is less comfortable, it can be alluring, especially on days where you're tired and looking for an excuse, to replace it with something similar or easier such as weighted 2-arm hangs or arm lifts. But I think nothing beats training the one-arm hang than doing it itself. Even on the hard days, find ways to inspire you to
Just do it!
With Hosuk recently posting some pretty cool one-arm 3-finger drag stuff now, that's the direction I'm really inspired to work towards. Trying to get longer and longer hang times by specifically training the 20mm itself, and I also found it helpful to take it a step further by training it combined with the one-arm pull-up for better application to climbing. Because I got shut down by it before, I really thought it'd take me forever to combine it with the one-arm, but since I kept training my one-arm pull-ups once per week on maintenance to keep a baseline ability to do 1 on each arm, I actually got it the session right after trying it because neurological adaptations are so fast. The lesson learned here for me is you just have to push for it, and session by session, if you're at an appropriate weight, producing enough 3-finger drag force to solidly add on a one-arm pull-up will feel easier and easier. Anecdotally, it was only until I started adding this extra layer of complexity that I felt an improvement in my right hand 3-finger drag strength and hang time, which was always lagging behind the left hand. By pushing myself further than just doing hangs, executing an added pull-up made me conjure up more force, effort, and thus more training stimulus to the right hand to break my personal plateau. I really think that just sticking to doing hangs only at this point was very self-limiting for improvement, and it kept me in a cage in terms of perceiving that my right hand would always be weaker than my left. And because I'm adding this extra layer of complexity, the previous layer, which was just hangs, started to see an increase in tolerable hang time. Compared to staying around 6 seconds or less in previous videos, for the intro of this video, I did these hangs back to back with the pull-up attempts, so in total I was performing longer hang times than previous in between dedicated rest periods. Of course, there's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs to this, so I first had to quit any exercises that popped and cracked my hands and wrist joints, which reduced inflammation and flaring in my hand, and then progressively pushed for longer hang times and then pushing further to add the pull-up. Healthy fingers first. But yeah, thanks for watching this video. It was so long. If you start on this journey and ever get demotivated, just watch Hosuk's video. This is like a dream problem, and if I ever send it, I'll probably make a follow-up video of the process of getting the 3-finger drag to be this insanely strong. But until then, keep on the lookout for the next video of the series, which will be on the 15mm one-arm half crimp.